You're listening to 3 Days Through the Wood, a novel by Bear Mawasaki, as read by the author. Chapter 14. Long Road Home. The further he walked, the colder it got. Streams and rivers weren't babbling through the distant wood now, but whispering, and then gasping and choking their last breaths through thickening ice. Fingers of frost grasped out from the shadowed places beyond the water's edge, and began to stroke against the trees in defiance of the sun. The white clouds had all fallen to earth in heavy drifts, leaving only their dark twins to rule the skies. Pill shook his head and brushed his shoulders. This helped to keep a crust from forming over him. Already the snow was crunching softly underfoot in that wet sort of way that could call children to arms. Perfect packing snow, he thought, and it was landing on him heavily. The drifts were thick enough that he could probably shape it into a shelter if he needed, like he had read people do off in the far north. But even if it really worked, the technique would do him little good. He wanted to leave the forest, not live in it, and so he continued to walk even as the road started to vanish beneath the whiteout of the storm. If he was to phrase the entire situation as charitably as he could, Pill would have to say that the weather was unpleasant. He knew the worst thing to do in an unpleasant situation was to dwell on it, however, so even as the ice and snow tried to pry into the pant legs tucked into his boots, even as it clung tightly to his fleece and hood to lick at his skin, even as the storm overhead drummed threatening reminders of a season without pity, Pill did his best to keep his mind occupied, letting his thoughts carry him somewhere far away. The forest served as a stage to that end. Its wild visage was washed clean by the snow in a white and untouched canvas. The light was still stranger in the deeper sects of those woods, and so the shadows played over them like the rippling depths of his river of memory. He had come back this way to try and remember, and so it was finally time to try. Still, there was a reluctance to just fully dive in, much like the way one might hesitate to leap into a cold river on a hot summer day. Pill figured he must have been the sort of child who waded in only a little at a time, even as others splashed and dived around him, urging him to just get it over with while the water slowly crept up his legs and into his trunks, clinging in sudden wet and tight embarrassment. He was the slow and cautious sort, and he would take his memories the same way. Guilt burned in the pit of his stomach, but whether it was for something he had done, or the simple fact that he was almost too ashamed to look at his own life, he couldn't say. The thought that he might have done something terrible haunted him, and he almost didn't want to know. But he had seen what running away looked like, and he had no desire to join in with Mr. Scratch and his troop of troublemakers in their endless migration from yesterday's demons. With the snowbound forest his stage, and the dance of light and shadow his actors, Pill watched in trepid fascination as the show finally began. They were a family of 7 moving through the wood together. His family. Short round mother led all the children by hand, while broad-shouldered father, tipping his ever-present wide-brimmed hat against the sun, forded the path for them. The children were a wide array of ages and sizes, and Pill saw himself standing in the middle of them. Pangs of lost joy echoed inside of him for a moment, from some place he had long forgotten, but they dimmed quickly. Perhaps the passage of time or the simple chill of the road were trying to steal that warmth from him, but he suspected it was something else. The ghost family, those echoes of yesterday, traveled together for a long while. Shadows moved through the trees, and Pill followed them from the road. He couldn't hear their words exactly, but the sound played in his mind regardless, as if through some long tunnel. He could hear the tone if not make out the words, and listened to the excited yelling of his younger siblings at play, heard the snide asides of his older sister as she grew bored yet again, and listened to the hushed murmurs of his eldest brother as he spoke with father in fevered tones. Pill's shadow was the only quiet one among them. While their mother lectured excitedly, he seemed to be the only one who noticed the things they weren't discussing. The conversation held only in awkward silences and sideways glances between those in the know, and Pill never saw the sense in speaking unless it was something of substance. He shivered, then flexed his fingers to keep them nimble. They curled at a snail's pace into his palm. His pockets weren't enough to keep them warm anymore. With a kind of road-borne yoga technique, Pill twisted himself inside of his fleece so that he could withdraw his arms without taking it off, and managed to bury his hands inside the pits of his arms. They were like blocks of ice at his side, and slick with melted snow. His view of the family vanished around a curve in the road, and when he found them again they were fractured. Father's shadow was missing. They were 6 now, moving through the wood, in a time when they were much younger. 2 of the children were so small that they could barely walk, and Mother led each of them by the hand while Pill and his siblings walked freely. Without regulation of pace or place, they scattered among the trees. His brother ran off far ahead, scrambling up over branches and bringing back things for Mother to identify, speaking calmly but quickly about his discoveries as he tried to learn the many names of the wood. Their sister, on the other hand, fell far behind. With no one and nothing to pull her along save guilt and obligation, she trailed behind only reluctantly. Her hands seemed to recoil from every outreach of the forest, and even in silhouette, Pill could see her shadow roll its eyes at every fun fact given to her by her mother or brother. This was a place that she had outgrown years ago, and she would stay here only as long as she needed to. Father wasn't along that day because he was always so busy, Pill remembered. It was actually a rarity that he would join them in their walks. More often he was busy tending to the fields or fixing something around the farm, earning a living and making sure his family had enough to eat. Mother was more the homemaking type, and so hers was the face that they saw most often. Pill remembered how he had learned his 3 R's from her, readin', writin', and arithmetic. That was a colloquialism, of course. Their childhood education had actually been very thorough by their mother's hand, and their many walks together through the wood were testament to that. Children needed to move and play and be free to indulge their curiosity if they were going to learn, she said, and so her lessons always took place out beneath the sun and sky. She identified for them the many mysteries of the forest broad, explaining to them all the calls and cries of the creatures within it. Pill was still young enough at the time to have an enthusiasm for that sort of thing. When he pointed out a chipmunk hiding in the trees, she could name for him its exact type, guess at how old he was from the size of it, and where it was headed from this time of day. She could tell him what he ate, where he found his food, and when exactly he would sleep as the sun slipped over the sky, as well as where he most likely lived. She taught them all to track things the same way. Mother had been a boundless well of wisdom when it came to wild things, and young Pill had been full of questions. Those were probably the happiest days of his life. The warmth of his slowly returning memories was almost enough to keep him strong against the cold, but sharp winds cut at his face and snapped Pill back to the present. When he managed to blink all the gathering ice out from his eyes, the scene before him had changed again. They were 5 now. Oldest brother was gone. Pill remembered how he had started spending more and more time with Father out in the fields as he got older, learning the family trade. There wasn't much use to learning anything else when he already knew what he wanted to be, and so he had passed on the opportunity to head to school proper, passed on college and university and everything else the world could have offered him, instead settling for the simplicity of the field. Something about that made Pill angry, but he didn't know why. Their sister, on the other hand, made frequent voice of her displeasure. Her arguments still echoed in his mind, and even when he couldn't make out all the words, he still felt beneath his skin the feeling those arguments evoked, could hear the chilling anger and resentment in his sister's voice. "We're always out in these stupid woods," was the core of her feeling. She expressed it in many ways and used many negative prefixes along the lines of boring, upsetting, and uninteresting, accompanied by a lot of eye-rolling. The problem, Pill remembered, was that she cared nothing for the farm or forest. When the opportunity to enter the school system came along, she jumped on it. After that, she had spent every day telling Pill excitedly about the many friends she was making, and the many things she was learning about small town and big city living. It had lit a spark in her he had never seen before. As his sister started to blossom into someone new, however, her love for the family seemed to fade. Eventually, when it became clear that Pill did not share her enthusiasm for school and things beyond the homestead, she started to speak with him less. They had never been close to begin with, but it seemed their one chance to finally bond had slipped him by. Now, when forced to join her family on walks through the woods, it was with great reluctance. Their mother eventually lost the will to keep fighting with her. There was no dramatic blow-up after their final argument, no screaming of things that couldn't be unsaid before a climactic conclusion sundered their family. There were no tearful reunions on the horizon, no mending of the feelings torn that day. Pill remembered listening to their last argument and recalled how he had made it his duty to direct the younger siblings off to the nearby river so that they could drown out the sound of the fighting. He sent them to hunting snipes amongst the reeds and walked back just far enough to listen to the argument himself. "I don't want to be here anymore, and I won't stay any longer than I have to." It was said in many more words than that, as both mother and daughter fought to find and express their feelings clearly, but that was the crux of it. It was the day that Pill first learned his family would eventually fracture, and his world collapsed just a little bit. His mother bore the brunt of that argument stoically enough, expressing her support for her daughter even as Pill could see her eyes dim. It was the first moment in his life that he truly felt powerless over a situation, but it wouldn't be the last. The snow fell thicker. Without his hands free to brush off the gathering granules, winter continued to pile on him unabated. Maybe if it stacked high enough around him, the snow could serve as insulation. He wondered if that would really work. When Pill looked up again, there were 4 shadows walking through the wood. It was the year Pill had entered the public school system, he remembered, and 1 year had been more than enough. The glamour of his sister's stories had quickly worn away, and he saw to the truth of what that institution really was. He was smarter than the other children from the beginning, reading books while some struggled to grasp what an R even was, and his sole year of school had been the worst of his life. He spent every day wishing he was back at home, back in the wood, and his evening walks with his family were the sole solace against the raging inhumanity he dealt with on the daily. Children were monsters, he thought, and he wanted nothing to do with them. As smart as he was, the intricacies of social interaction eluded him. It wasn't something he could simply study in a book. It required practical application to seriously grasp, and Pill found he had no patience for playground politics. Nor did he see reason to hide his disdain. That made him a target for the other children, and even as his parents and teachers tried to convince him that the other children only made fun of him out of jealousy, he recognized the deeper truth. He wasn't like the other children, and he never would be. The only lasting lesson school had imparted was that something inside of Pill was fundamentally broken, and it could never be fixed. His parents kept him there for 1 year. That was the commitment each of the children had to make when they tried the public school system, and it was the worst year of his life. Even when he returned home and took his walks through the woods, his family had grown smaller. It was just him, the younger siblings, and his mother when they went out now, and they were taking more and more of her attention as they grew. Pill usually spent his time reading books. There was a stump just off the trail they frequently used, which opened to a perfect gap in the canopy where the sun could shine down on him. The sun was lost behind the clouds. Pill almost tripped through the heavy snow, now risen halfway to his boots. He found he was pushing himself forward more than he was walking as the drifts started to rise into snow walls covering the road. There were 3 shadows in the wood. This time they traveled without parents. Pill let his younger siblings alone that day because Mother had taken ill. The stress of everything unspoken was getting to her, and she had asked him over their sparse breakfast to look after the little ones that day. Father and brother were busy in the fields, and sister was off to school, so it was just Pill and the twins. They still weren't old enough for school themselves, but they needed activity and exercise, and would only raise a ruckus if kept at Mother's bedside. Besides, Pill was spending more and more of his time locked away in his room, and it would do him good to spend a day in the sun, she said. He had more misgivings about accepting such a responsibility than he had counter-arguments, and so the duty was foisted off on him. That continued for the next week. They would set off in the morning, and Pill would try to recall all the information their mother had passed on to him so he could repeat it to the twins. They both claimed to already know everything he tried to teach, and seemed utterly uninterested whenever he managed to surprise them with something new. They seemed alien to him. Being twins, the two had never lacked for company, and so they felt as different from lonely and isolated Pill as a man from the moon might feel from a man of Earth. Pill was neck-deep in books at the time, devouring as many as the library would let him take home, and so his sense of reality had started to become detached. Half the time he was living in the clouds, riding starships or going on adventures in some undiscovered corner of a far-off world, and the other half he was barely at home. Even when he was in lessons with his mother, his mind would wander elsewhere. The answers he gave to her questions, while usually correct, were never given with any interest. The matters of the world interested in him less and less than did the world of fiction. The world was a cruel and cold place, he thought, and everyone was eventually going to leave him anyway. He saw no point in investing himself any longer. Save for his body, the whole of his being now resided somewhere that no one else could see. The week was long and difficult, and yet when it was over, Pill realized it was one of the last good weeks of his life. Flecks of snow and ice stung at his eyes. He blinked furiously to clear his vision, shivering hard to keep warm. His legs felt like, well, they no longer had feeling. He looked down to make sure they were still there at least, and when he looked back up, the scene had changed again. There were two shadows alone in the wood. One was sat atop a stump, head buried in a book. The weight of that day fell on him like a storm. He remembered how he thought he was alone in the wood at first. His shadow gave a small jump at the approach of Father, whose wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over pages too tear-stained to read. They had talked about something that day, addressed the truth left unspoken over the last year. Pill thought he had wanted to handle it head-on, but when Father finally approached him alone, openly, to speak honestly, one-on-one, Pill realized he never really wanted to hear any of it. He didn't want to remember it now. They spoke of death that day, and the way it seeps into our lives and hearts in its slow, inevitable way. Pill watched the shadow of his father and himself talk for a time, hearing the faint echoes of a long-ago conversation turn to slush in his ears. He still wasn't ready to listen. This was the beginning of everything he had been running from. "No," he said to no one. "I don't want it." His feet continued almost automatically, trudging him forward while inside himself he was screaming about which way to go. He didn't want to run away again. He had to run away. There was no choice but to see the truth. The truth would kill him. There was a deep resentment and anger building in him, and that flame carried him against the cold. The walk with his father had been a gentle one. None of the anger he felt was directed at him. Pill's curses were for life and circumstance, for a world he had no say in. "Would you just stop?" he yelled, looking to the sky. Flecks of white buried in his face as he stared into the dark clouds. Thunder rumbled. "I'm sick of this. I'm sick of everything. I'm sick of the cold. I'm sick of the snow. I'm sick of this stupid forest. Leave me alone." The wood gave no answer. His younger self had yelled something very similar. Pill picked up from his reading place in the wood, his last safe corner of the world now finally breached by cold truth, and he ran. His father tried to follow, but he was too slow, too sickly, and Pill shouted something then that he could never take back. "Then just die already!" Pill was still running. He ran now through the snow. He couldn't tell where he was in the forest, couldn't tell how far he still had to go. He might have turned around and started walking the other way and would never have known it. His footsteps filled in almost as fast as he left them, and the forest was a stranger beneath the shroud of snow. As to where he was trying to go, he supposed he never had an answer to that in the first place. He ran until his legs finally gave out, too frozen to move. Hands wormed their way from his fleece to dig into the surface snow, too cold to feel the cold anymore, and they started to drag him forward. There was one shadow left in the wood now, and it was watching him. Despite the shadow of the storm, he could see the gleam of their eyes watching him from beneath a wide-brimmed hat.